Hi, I'm McGrath, cabinet maker. In this video I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of plywood, particle board, and MDF as cabinet construction material. The reason I'm going to do that is because there's a lot of people have very strong opinions about this, a lot of misconceptions. People generally think, ooh, plywood good and particle board bad and MDF terrible, and without really understanding the sort of relative benefits of any of them as a building material. And the reality is there's certain things, plywood's good for some things, particle board's good for some things, and MDF is good for other things. And it just depends what you want to do. So I'm going to start with plywood. Plywood, basically what it is just layers of wood that is put in opposite directions to each other. So these thin layers of wood, plywood is a very strong material. It's light and it's strong. It's a very good structural material, so if you were going to build a subfloor, once you screw it down to the wood, it's very rigid and it's good for tiling. It withstands moisture very well, so if you're doing it in a bathroom and you want a subfloor under your tiles where there's consistently going to be dampness kind of seeping through, then plywood is pretty much the only material you would use. It's also strong, so when you screw joint here, this is pretty rigid construction. The screws will hold pretty well, so it gives it a lot of strength, and it's light. So in some instances where if you're doing freestanding furniture in a room for cabinet construction, or if you want it to be light, let's say you're building freestanding furniture for a children's bedroom, plywood is a good choice because it's light and it's strong, and you can get reasonable veneers on it and get a decent finish. It's not used a lot in cabinet construction, and the reason I don't generally use it, because the downfall of plywood is because you have these various grains running against each other, plywood will warp, and it's a big problem. If you leave plywood just kind of out, sitting on a shelf, it will, and I've built cabinets with plywood before, and sometimes the whole side of the cabinet will blow out. And they're always a little bit off, and the other thing about plywood is the layers of wood are not necessarily uniform thickness. So a sheet of plywood, even though it's supposed to be 3/4 inch, will be a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch off, and the problem with that is, and it's not even from sheet to sheet, it's not even, or even across the same sheet, there's differences. So from a cabinet maker's perspective, it's always a little bit wonky and there's a lot of adjustment, and you don't get as accurate a cut. And then with the warping, you come to put your cabinets up and they're a little bit warped, and so that's another disadvantage. Another disadvantage is the surface is not going to be as smooth as either particle board or MDF, where it's just a flat surface and it's made in a giant press and it's 100% uniform. So the surface isn't necessarily smooth. So there's reasons why, as a cabinet, although it's strong and it's light, as a cabinet making material, it's not necessarily my favorite choice. And certainly, as a cabinet making material, for kitchen cabinets, if they're screwed into place, I would rather not use it, and I recommend not using it. The one thing I would definitely tell clients is don't use plywood for cabinet doors, because on a cabinet, or a built-in cabinet, it's screwed into place. If you're using it on a subfloor, it's actually nailed down to the actual framework, so it's not going to go anywhere. If you use plywood for cabinet doors, it's a real problem, because a cabinet door essentially is a piece of wood suspended on 2 points flopping in the breeze. So there's nothing to keep it from twisting and turning in its own natural way, and plywood will definitely do this. This is a cabinet door that I took off a project. I advised the woman, I said, don't use plywood, you'll regret it. A year later she phoned me and she said, yeah, you got to come back and change this door. I don't know if you can see how warped that is. I mean, this is a flat surface, so it should sit flat on this surface, and it wiggles. So, and when it was on the cabinet, it looked terrible, so I replaced it. And in those scenarios, it's kind of who's to blame. It's unfortunate, but it's just a sort of added expense because I told her not to use it. So don't use plywood for cabinet doors. It's a big mistake, and you'll regret it. And it's difficult too once cabinets are painted or stained or lacquered, the cabinets are going to change over time with the sun. So if you end up, I had one job where all the doors warped, or not all of them, but significantly, but the color had kind of weathered, or not weathered, but it had a certain patina that the cabinets had obtained from the natural light, and it looked beautiful. It was beautiful grain, and so we decided, well, we can't replace these doors because the grain was so beautiful, and the way the patina had changed over time with the light made it even more beautiful, but they were warped. So I said, well, we'll fiddle with the hinges, we'll do what we can, but we're just going to have to leave it with a little bit of warp because it looks so, the grain looks so beautiful. So I wouldn't recommend plywood for cabinet doors. What I recommend mostly for cabinet construction is particle board. Now particle board has a bad name, and that's from the 70s and 80s. A lot of mass production housing, they put cheap particle board kitchens in, and it wasn't so much that the particle board in itself was so bad, but it was that the construction was very cheap. The real culprit would be particle board drawers. One of the things about particle board is this joint, if you screw here, it's not as strong, like the particle board can split easier than plywood. So that joint wouldn't be as strong as plywood. That's okay if it's screwed to the wall. Where it's not okay is where you have what's called a dynamic load. If kitchen cabinets, built-in cabinets, they're basically fixed to the wall, they're never going to move. What holds them rigid is the fact that they're screwed together and screwed to the wall. A drawer, however, is sliding in and out all the time. There's a lot of what engineers call dynamic load on that. And if you have a drawer that made out of particle board, where it's just stapled particle, or screwed or stapled particle board, in the cheap kitchens, all they would do is staple it. And this is 3/4, but they use 5/8 plywood, staple it at the joint. It really has no strength. And so all these particle board kitchens from the 80s, where they just used super cheap stapled particle board, the drawers were the ones that fell apart. And not only would they use this cheap particle board on the sides, but they would use very thin 1/8 material on the bottom. And particularly on a wide drawer, this just has no strength. It just, well, you guys have all seen that, right? So the culprit is not that particle board is bad in all instances, but it was just used where it wasn't very appropriate in a lot of cheap kitchens, and that's why people hate it. However, the particle board I use for cabinets, first of all, it's typically, it's a beautiful material, a nicer sample. Well, first of all, I guess the issue is drawers. I just don't use particle board drawers. For my cabinets, I use either a dovetail solid wood drawer, so that sort of eliminates the problem altogether. That's virtually an indestructible joint. Even on the cheaper cabinets, I use a drawer which, I mean, sometimes people ask me to do a laundry room and I say, look, we don't want to spend a lot on dovetail drawers, we want cheaper ones. It's a particle board bottom, solid part, but 3/4 inch, but it's an integrated metal side. Now these also are pretty much indestructible. This is a really solid drawer. This is not going to come apart. It'll hold a lot of weight. The 3/4 inch is screwed into the bottom. So this is an instance where, when you've got the integrated sides, that a particle board drawer is really not such a problem. And this particular drawer is very inexpensive. A kind of intermediary drawer is this one. It's a similar concept. You have an integrated metal side with the slide. You do have particle board at the bottom, but it's a heavy 3/4 inch or 5/8 piece of particle board. This one is just more expensive than the other one I showed you because it's got the soft close. Here's another instance where you can get away with particle board on a drawer if it's fastened to the integrated slide, where the sides of it are metal and they're going to hold it together and you have a solid piece in the bottom. So particle board will work for a drawer in those instances, but not the way it was done in a lot of kitchens from the 70s, 80s, mass production kitchens. It just fell apart, but don't use it. But I do use, I like to use particle board for the insides of my cabinets. The reason being, It doesn't warp. It's a very rigid material. It gives a really nice smooth surface. The width of the material is very consistent, so it's very easy to get accurate cabinets with particle board that don't warp and are solid and strong. And because basically cabinets are going to be screwed to the wall and screwed to each other, there's actually no load on this joint. So there's not going to be any movement on this joint because they're screwed into place. So that is not a problem at all. Particle board doesn't handle water quite as well as plywood. It's not so much of a problem. This is particle board. This is a natural maple finish with what's called a UV coating on it, which is a very hard sort of lacquer, a special super hard lacquer, and it's waterproof. So water will get on this. This is completely water resistant. You don't have to worry about it. If your cabinets were sort of sitting in 6 inches of water, it would actually damage the particle board. But there's not a lot of instances in a kitchen where that's going to be a problem. One of the things that they used to, and I'll show you this, in the there again, 70s and 80s, the cabinets were sitting flat on the floor. My cabinets, I hope you can see this, I'm going to check, are yes, sitting on these little plastic legs. So the cabinets are actually, there's no wood touching the floor when I build a kitchen. So even though, you know, if this were sitting in water, it would soak it up. This is not touching the floor. These legs, incidentally, are good for 350 kilograms or something like that. So a huge amount of weight. They're also handy because you can run wires or pipes or anything underneath the cabinet. So they're very functional. But there's no way wood can soak up into this cabinet from the floor. So that's not a problem. If I'm doing an end gable for a cabinet, I always put my end gable, and I don't know if you can see it, these little plastic spacers. So even an end gable on a cabinet, like that, I don't leave it sitting on the floor. So there's no wood touching the floor. There's no way that water can soak up into this. In terms of the cabinet, unless you had a flood in your floor, which is 4 inches of water, you won't touch the cabinet. Sorry about that. And even on the end gable, if you have, say, 2 inches of water, we could place the end gable and the cabinets wouldn't be damaged. So water isn't such a problem for particle board cabinets. So it's not really an issue in terms of the moisture. And it's a nice material, it's a solid material, and it has a really nice finish on it. So I like to use particle board. And it's also good, if this were, say, a cabinet door, you can get nice veneers on it and finish it, and you get a really nice particle board door with a lacquered finish. This actually was a door before it was an end gable. And you can get it in cherry and mahogany and whatever, and it won't work. So it's a nice, particle board is a nice material for cabinet construction and for slab doors. Finally, MDF. The difference between particle board, basically, both these are compressed sawdust particle board, but it's bigger chunks. Makes it more heavy than plywood, a little bit lighter than MDF. MDF is medium density fiber. What it is essentially, it's also compressed sawdust, but it's much finer sawdust. What that does makes it heavier, but also the big advantage, it's not as strong as plywood. It's in terms of the strength of the way it holds screws. It's pretty much like particle board, maybe ever so slightly stronger. It's a very heavy material. It's not a great material to make cabinet boxes out of. I don't really bother using it for that. What MDF is nice for is just for finishing materials. I use it a lot for trimming out cabinets, things like that, for end gables and trim components. You can make nice paint grade. It paints beautifully. It sands nicely and paints beautifully, so you can make cabinet doors out of MDF. It has a lot of the same properties as the particle board. It's just a little bit heavier. So I don't bother using it. It's not for cabinet construction. I use the particle board. In terms of price, plywood is a little more expensive. It's not a huge difference in terms of from a cabinet maker's perspective. If you're using a decent grade material in any of those, the cost of the materials is not going to change the overall cost of the project all that significantly. Another thing that concerns people also is formaldehyde and the smell of glue and things. This is not so much of a problem as it used to be. I know in the 70s and 80s, when you had a particle board cabinet, if you stuck your head in it, it was enough to knock you out. I mean, the smell of the glue was so strong. That's not the case. Any domestically or say North American manufactured plywood or particle board or MDF really has very low trace elements of off-gassing. Most of them meet what's called the CARB 2 standard, which is the California Air Regulatory Board. Most of them meet those standards. I think nearly all of them. Any of the ones I use do, which are very stringent standards in terms of air quality. So it's not the way it used to be where you could smell it. And the other thing is, once this is installed, nearly always it's going to be lacquered or UV coated. So it's all sealed up. So it's not like this stuff is kind of emitting gas into your environment all the time. On the other hand, if you particularly want like zero formaldehyde, or what do they say, no added formaldehyde in the glue, which is even more stringent, it is possible to order that in any of these materials. It's just a little more expensive and there's a little more lead time in ordering. So hopefully that gives you a good idea. Plywood is lighter and stronger. It's not as dimensionally stable as particle board. MDF is heavier. It's a nice material for painting. It's a nice material for doing trim details. I like to do, I can show you here, whoops, the detail in this drawer. MDF paints nicely. You can route the edges of it and paint the edges so you can get sort of trim details work nicely in MDF. And I think that's about it. So hopefully that clears up some of the differences or some of the confusion around which material is best for what usage. Thank you.